Welcome back, climbers. I'm your co-host, Kaylee Floyd, and this is another episode of Climbing Mount CMMC. In today's episode, we're joined by Karen Stanford. Karen is a seasoned cybersecurity professional with over 20 years of experience. She is the president and founder of Archstone Security, and she also has the CMMC Provisional Assessor certification. She has extensive knowledge on conducting FedRAMP assessments, and we are so excited to dive into the topic, what is security protection data and assets? So without further ado, let's get into today's episode.
Karen, let me first start off by saying, what's kind of controversial when it comes to security protection data, and what is it?
Sure. So I think it's, in general, it is the announcement that this is going to extend, the boundary. What they have recently decided is that your CMMC boundary needs to include security protection data, even if it's not within your environment. So this would mean that if you are doing monitoring with a third-party security operations center and you are porting all of your data over to their data center, that their data center is now in the CMMC boundary and needs to be subject to the same requirements. So your choices would be either to work with a security operations center that has an existing CMMC accreditation or perhaps FedRAMP, and or they need to get accredited themselves. So that is a lot of organizations in the DIB currently relied on managed service providers to help them do what they don't know how to do. And so this is bad news for all of them in that it is now extending the boundary into their environment, and they may potentially need to become accredited.
So a lot of the wisdom I think that people were thinking about is, okay, I'm going to get into CMMC, right? And when I get into CMMC, I can start using other partners or vendors. And as long as they're not specifically completing controls that involve collecting CUI, they can participate and help, like a SOC, like you're saying. So they can look at your SIM and those types of stuff. But once they put the security protection data label on that type of data, as they ingest it, now they have a responsibility, which I think is what everybody's kind of getting pretty up in arms about.
Yeah, there's definitely some concern. So this isn't a surprising move for me in that occurred for FedRAMP already. And the concern from the parts of the feds are that some of the data that is being exported has great interest to adversaries. If you are ingesting audit data, if you are a managed service provider and you're ingesting audit data for a CMMC environment that shows that FTP is enabled on a host that's public facing, then people are going to have interest in that data and it can be used to exploit the system. So that's the concern. So let's first kind of talk about what security protection data is from the perspective of FedRAMP, because that's all we have to go on at this point. We're assuming that they're going to model it after FedRAMP. So that's typically going to be any audit or event data. And then you're also going to have any vulnerability scanning data. If you're using vulnerability scanning as a service and that your data is living in their environment, then that's going to extend the boundary into their environment under this new, interpretation of the guidance. So
do you feel that is going to be a bit of the lens that DoD is going to look through when they're talking about this through FedRAMP and their experience and utilization of how they did it there?
I think so. I think that the risk is the same for both. It's that this is security related data that shows security vulnerabilities, and it's not in a protected environment. So I do think that will be how they do it. For me, it's a bit of a disappointment in that you're going to get more effective monitoring from someone who does it for a living than being concerned about your boundary extending into those additional networks and then opting to keep it in-house where you don't know what you're doing. So for me, there's kind of a trade-off, but I do understand the risk that the federal entities are trying to address with this.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely makes sense. But if I look, correct me if I'm wrong, through 800, 171 and 171A, and I look at the NARA, I don't see anything about security protection data until the proposed rule dropped. And then, all of a sudden, here's this thing that they're talking about. It makes sense. But boy, did it seem like a right cross out of nowhere.
It did. I think especially for anyone who was not, in the FedRAMP space where it was a big, bomb dropped on them too, just a few years earlier. So, but I think the security protection data, I think initially the intent was to for FedRAMP, you need to assess everything. You need to assess your Linux servers. You need to assess your Windows servers. You need to assess your network devices, et cetera. You have to do the whole full control set for all of them. And I think that's I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that the intent of creating the term security protection asset for CMMC was to say you don't need to do all of that. You don't need to test all of the controls for the 801.71 for your firewall. You need to test only specific controls related to it. But unfortunately, I think it's just kind of a runaway train at this point with people using, what I'm seeing is people are trying to designate something as a security protection asset so they can kind of remove it from the boundary. So I'm not a fan of the term, but I understand the need for it.
Yeah. So just to make sure those people that are listening that aren't 100% in the know about this is that CUI, right, controlled unclassified information, and security protection data, they're not the same thing, but there's this fear that it's going to start to become possibly the same thing, but it has been utilized by the ruling in no uncertain terms as a mechanism to loop in managed service providers like myself. So because managed service providers are trying to get in there and say, okay, we'll help with providing services for this company. But, we're only doing certain types of things. So therefore we don't need to get level 2 certified ourselves. But once that security protection data comes into their environment, they're going to have to, the way that I read the rule, and if I'm getting it wrong, please correct me, Karen, but they're going to pull us in and we're going to have to get level 2. To match parity with who we're supporting, because that security protection data is going to make us have to do that.
I think that is the correct interpretation. And I think there's kind of two ways to look at it. If you're a managed service provider and you are doing a lot of support for organizations that are attempting to get CMMC accredited, it could be a differentiator for you to go ahead and get, a CMMC level 2, because then everyone can use you. But as we've learned throughout this process, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. So, it's a bit of a struggle for managed service providers to figure out what to do. But I think, what I'm recommending to folks who are in that boat is to attempt to leave whatever the security protection data that they have ingested into their environment, to try to put that back into their client's environment. So this may consist of, instead of porting all your auditing and monitoring or your log data into a security operations center, you may want to bring that in-house and have your security center analysts come in through a virtual desktop into your environment and work with it from there. Now, that is not always feasible. A lot of the tools that they need to use to conduct analysis are not in the environment. So overall, it's a double-edged sword in that they're trying to protect the data, which is of interest to adversaries. However, it is now kind of limiting how the DIB can protect itself. It's not as easy for them to fulfill the requirements for CMMC.
And you touched on this, Karen, and I think when we were talking earlier before we did the recording, and I think it's definitely worth pausing and really kind of covering this a little bit more specifically, is this ruling or this proposed rule is going to push a lot of people to start trying to keep the data in-house and try to manage it themselves when they may not necessarily be the best qualified person to do that. Because of the fact that security protection data is so new from the perspective of people who are trying to get involved and get aligned for CMMC weren't quite ready for it. And so it's a barren wasteland out there as far as organizations that are FedRAMP that can handle this type of data, and managed service providers or MSSPs or other SOC organizations, like you said, that have those appropriate certifications. Because right now, the CMMC certifications aren't happening right now. So no one can say, I've got it. So the only other option is what? FedRAMP. And or FedRAMP equivalent. And so I just kind of want to open the box a little bit to however you feel comfortable to talk about what the risk is of organizations now having to feel like they have to keep that data local. And then what does trying to go into the FedRAMP space or try to look for those or try to, the equivalency. Can you sort of maybe try to make that mud a little bit clearer for us about that?
Yeah, I think one of the risks is that most of the FedRAMP accredited software infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, et cetera, most of that is geared towards federal technology.
Right.
It's designed for office workers who are working with data, and the defense industrial base tends to do quite a bit of manufacturing. So there's a lot of programs that are used heavily by the DIB that really don't have any interest in selling direct to the government. So there's going to be my first concern with this is that there are not enough tools that are certified for the DIB to be able to continue to support the defense, the Department of Defense. That for me is a significant concern. It's kind of pulling the plug on cloud in a lot of ways. So that's a significant concern. And then also, I think it's, while this did occur for FedRAMP, at some point they were like, okay, now we want you to start using FedRAMP accredited, solutions in your environment. But they did that after there was enough to kind of choose from. There were some gaps, but they didn't really wait to do that until there were products that you could use. And that's another concern for me, is that there's nobody can use anything. There's nothing that's accredited. And I don't know how that works with the chicken and the egg,
Right.
Because I don't know that you can get, assessed under the joint if you're, you need to have a contract with the government. You need to be a prime or a sub. And a lot of these folks aren't going to be able to do a joint surveillance to get accredited for CMMC because they don't have, the means. And so there's a lag in being able to implement all of this that I think that nobody's considered. And I think that's going to cause some problems.
Well, with organizations starting to pull stuff in, just for us, because, we decided early last year that we were going to go ahead and try to be one of the first over the hill to get level 2 certified ourselves. But we made some assumptions about some cloud options that we might have available. And once we started seeing stuff about security protection data, we were like, oh man, this is not going to work. We started to have to pull some of this stuff in-house. We started having to look for vendors that do allow for hosting options, which, circa 4 years ago, everybody thought was just old school. Everybody's going cloud. Nobody's doing that. Now with this rule, it seems like everybody's like, okay, self-hosting's back on the table again, folks, and we need to start doing that. But, for me, it was a challenge about education and trying to make sure that our team is ready to handle the requirements, because it wasn't something that we were really accustomed to doing. And it's a challenge for us, and I can only imagine how it would be for organizations that are trying to do it themselves. Can you speak to that and how that might either help or hurt security?
Yeah, so I think that one of the first things that folks are going to need to think through is with respect to cloud, is what I'm using actually a cloud service? I think that we are seeing some evidence that folks don't really understand that. They're like, oh my God, I need to have a FedRAMP accreditation, because I'm, I have all of my system components are hosted on a cloud service provider. Well, that doesn't make you a cloud service provider. There's what you really need to think about is, of your client's data that could be considered sensitive, where does it live, and how can I make it not live there? So if you are doing vulnerability scanning and right now you are jumping into an environment and conducting the scans, pulling the data over to your environment and analyzing it, just do that in their environment. That's an easy one. That's a relatively easy fix. But it is going to be tough. The first thing to do is figure out, are you cloud? If you're attempting to, figure out if you need to do FedRAMP, are you cloud? And then also, where does the data live, and can I make that different?
So for us as a managed service provider, we're going to be having some of those tools that are going to have security protection data in our GCC High environment, and that will all be part of our assessment when we get assessed ourselves. So when we get level 2 certified, that will all be included in our assessment process. Is that, in your opinion, an option for people who can still participate without having to go with the whole FedRAMP process for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, absent the ability to immediately become accredited, which nobody has right now, you should you should prepare for it. You should assume that if your objective is to host data from folks who are going for CMMC level 2 or level 3 or whatever is for you to become accredited at that level and to start to work towards that end. So that's, I think, the way to go, with respect to getting prepared.
Right. Now, for vendors, that may not necessarily be that easy, right? Because they have build levels and revs and things that they're trying to track, and trying to get a whole product line to go through a level 2 certification, let alone FedRAMP, is not going to necessarily be an easy thing for them.
It's not. And what I recommend is for you to understand where that federal data that's of concern. And this would probably be audit log data, any vulnerability data, anything to do with any security state in your environment. Your first thing is to understand where that lives, and to try to the extent possible, to consolidate that all into one CUI boundary. Because some of the managed service providers are not just doing that. That's a piece of what they're doing for everyone else. So you want to create a little tight, concise environment with as little in there as possible to be able to serve your customers and then to make that compliant.
Good point. Yeah. I think earlier we had Wes on our show, and he talked about with vendors making sure that they knew about what they were collecting. So if that type of data that they're collecting falls in there, is there a way for them to disable that? If they can, and they can prove that they're not collecting that type of data, then now you start looking like an option that could be available for someone, because they have evidence to prove they're not collecting that type of data, and they can participate, which would be great because we need a lot more options than we've got right now.
Right. Currently I don't recommend any tools, but I do recommend that you understand what you're ingesting of your clients, whether it's security protection data, and with an interconnection security agreement to clearly delineate whose responsibility. For example, if you are transmitting data over to a managed service provider, are you the organization that needs a CMMC accreditation? Are you providing that encryption, or are they? So you need to really lock in what you're doing with respect to the data exchange and understanding where that data lives. And then you need to clearly delineate when you have a contract with anyone who's in this boat, anyone who's seeking CMMC accreditation or doing federal work, of what they need to do. You need to kind of absolve yourselves of any risk if, for example, something is seized in transit, or man-in-the-middle attack, something's taken in transit. Whose job was it to maintain that connectivity? So you need to understand who's doing what, and then you need to make sure the customer understands what they need to do.
So with that, is that more like a shared responsibility matrix where that's kind of outlined?
It could be, but that's not. I think if you were to go the CMMC route, then you would need to have one anyway. But there's, you could also accomplish something similar through an interconnection security agreement, just an understanding of whose controls do what. But I think a security control responsibility matrix that you provide for your service, whoever you're working with, would be a great idea.
Okay. All right, so let's switch gears here. If you feel like is now a good time to switch to security protection assets. You've touched on a little bit. Security protection data is kind of the new kid on the block of controversy. But security protection assets, people were a little bit surprised when they looked at the scoping guide and they're like, "What the heck is this?" Is it just appeared in the scoping guide? Correct?
Yeah.
And can maybe try to draw some things based on your FedRAMP experience about security protection assets? Because first off, let me just ask, is there such a thing in FedRAMP as far as in the delineation, or is that just something exclusive to CMMC? Okay. All right.
And I'm not, the biggest fan of the term, just because, I think to back up to what my interpretation of the intent was, is that in FedRAMP, when you do an 853 assessment, you need to test all of the controls for all of the components. So that would mean that if you have Windows components in your environment, you need to do the full scale of 853 testing. Or, what's relevant. Obviously, some don't matter, but you need to ensure that all the controls relevant to a technology are tested by OS, by platform, by component type, et cetera. So you have
You can't do a background check on a firewall, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's not going to work.
Right.
But I think the intent of the creation of this term was to say we aren't doing that here in CMMC. You only really need to care about, for example, the firewall in the context of it being a boundary protection device or providing your VPN or serving as that external perimeter. And to test it from that capability. So I think they created the term with good intents, but I think that what I'm seeing happen is because now the rules state that you don't need to do as much for things that are security protection assets or that have security protection data, that people are trying to shoehorn anything that's like not FIPS compliant or whatever into that category so they can kind of opt out of some of the controls that aren't being met. And so for me, that's the concern with this term, is that it's being used to try to carve things into a different bucket where they don't necessarily belong.
Yeah, because you've got CMRAs, you've got security protection assets, and then CUI assets, which are all going to have that exposure. And there's some others like specialized assets, but the SPAs to me seem to create the most amount of frustration, especially as I was kind of trying to get my head wrapped around it. And I've almost just started taking the attitude as I'm just treating it almost like a CUI asset from the perspective of if it's a Windows asset, I'm basically applying all possible policies and types of technical controls to limit and go through and accomplish every feasible way of applying controls that are relevant. Obviously, I can't do a background check on a domain controller, but there's certain things obviously it can't do, but we're going through it. But when I read that scoping guide and have looked at it, it seems like there's almost no distinction between a CUI asset and a security protection asset. I don't want to get into too dangerous waters, but can you give us a little bit more examples of what a security protection asset might be in a real world environment that would be labeled that way?
Sure. So for me, a security protection, I'll answer that, and then there's another piece I want to address. But a security protection asset would be something that is necessary in the environment for you to fulfill all the security control requirements for the framework. But they're saying, we don't want to go full scale on this. We don't need to test everything. So typically what you'll see for security protection assets are things like firewalls, VPNs, your multi-factor, your audit log data if you're using a SIM, if you are doing vulnerability scanning, anything like that, anything that is security related data or anything that is a tool that is providing a control within the framework. They're saying this must be in your boundary, but we don't need to do the full scale testing on it. So those are the most common things that you'll see. But I will say one of the things that this is kind of how we do it in FedRAMP. So the areas in which these come up the most would be, let me say how you can simplify it, I guess. If you are using some sort of federated or single sign-on capability for all the components in your environment, then when you test access controls, you are testing those components for access controls, as long as they are integrated with what you already have. If you're forcing multi-factor for everyone who comes into the environment, then you're testing that in AC. You don't need to look at it differently. But for the most part, where you're going to want those things to be doing compliant CMMC things is for your user login to them, for all the password policies that are pushed to them. If there's audit data coming out of those components, that's going to matter, as well as how are you managing these? Are you patching them? Are you scanning them, et cetera? So if you have an enterprise approach to those three capabilities, then all we really need to care about for your security protection assets is, are they working as intended to provide the requisite controls? So is your firewall actually protecting your perimeter? Is your VPN actually being forced for everyone and, functioning as intended in FIPS mode, et cetera. So, I think that's the best way to look at it, is to have enterprise management over all the components to the extent possible. At that point, you can kind of relax and just think about that component from the perspective of, is it doing what it needs to?
So if you're doing the more enterprise scoped assumed controls like patching and those types of things, a lot of that's going to be covered naturally.
It should, yeah. And so, that's one easy way to look at it is it's easy for you to say, I only want you to focus on the firewall for the firewall controls if you have the rest of that under, in scope. That every change you make to your firewall is going to go through the same change control process that you have. If all the users are provisioned the same way, if they, forced to do multi-factor, et cetera. That's the easiest way to kind of isolate a security protection asset for what it needs to be.
Gotcha. Karen, thank you so much for joining us today. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of share some things that you're doing and sharing content. The way that we found you is through the great posts that you've been doing on LinkedIn and comments and questions, because I've thrown out a lot of questions and you've shot so straight with me and given me some of the best clarity on some very controversial things when most people just want to keep their mouth closed because they didn't want to get toasted. But you kind of stepped out into that space and shared some things and were, a little fearless about getting trolled on some of that stuff. And I think you have great content, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share some things that you might be doing and sharing out there.
Yeah, I'm actually about to, I think one of the concerns that I think the defense industrial base and the CMMC folks are dealing with is this FedRAMP equivalency memo. So one of the things that I'm about to launch is an 853. It's a YouTube series called NIST Control Freak. And in it, I'm going to discuss all of the 853 controls, how you will assess it, how can you interpret it, how can you help implement it, pitfalls, as well as how can you actually assess it. So I think that it's just one of the things that I felt like in my career I had to do the most of. When people ask me questions, it's usually, how do I test this specific control, or this is what I'm seeing, how does this affect the interpretation of the control? So I'm trying to get that knowledge out there so folks know, because it's, I've collected it over 20 years and it's been through a lot of high-end organizations where I'm pretty sure that my interpretation at this point syncs with the rest of the federal government. So I'm trying to share that out with folks.
Wow.
So they can both help implement, because I've worked forever in the FedRAMP advisory space, helping folks get FedRAMP accredited. So they can help implement, and they can also learn how to test and to be prepared for their own audit.
So with CMMC, there's 320 assessment objectives. With FedRAMP, like, how many total sub-objectives, if you added them all up for FedRAMP moderate, what would that be?
Well, they just put the Rev 5 out, and, there's a different control count. It used to be 325 controls for a FedRAMP moderate baseline, but you have to understand that within that, there are subparts.
Right, yeah.
So, and then you also have to layer on the fact that FedRAMP makes you do it perhaps at the OS level, so there have been times in doing a FedRAMP assessment where the number of test cases I was doing was well over 3,000.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, it's a little bit different.
It's definitely on hard mode. I can't wait to see that and go through it. I'm sure that's probably going to be perhaps several years if you're trying to go through and cover some of that.
Because it's like I'm concerned about the revisions. I don't want any of my content to go stale, but just pull it off and put out a new one, I guess.
Well, I think the connection between CMMC and FedRAMP is critical to understand, and having that content out there would be massively helpful. I am not very savvy when it comes to the FedRAMP aspect, so and that's why we're going to have you back on the show just to talk about in our next podcast about kind of the connectivity and the commonality and the differences between FedRAMP and CMMC. There's a lot of connectivity between them. And there's also a lot of differences. Just as we were talking about, you can kind of see that very clearly. And so if you guys are just tuning in to this podcast, go back and look at some of the other things that we've done, and also make sure you pay attention to Karen's next one that's going to be coming up, that we're going to be talking about those connectivities, because I think it's super important for you to understand if you're doing the CMMC journey to really have a good understanding of how they kind of interconnect.
Make sure to follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube to stay up to date on the latest CMMC news. We hope you guys enjoyed today's episode and listen out for the next one. But until then, keep on climbing.